Great, welcome back. And we're now going to begin session number 3, private/public museums, which will explore in various ways the fates of private collections after they leave the hands of their creators. And for those of you who are just joining us today, my name is Kate Duffy. I'm a PhD student in American Studies here at Brown. And it is my sincere pleasure to introduce our 3 speakers. And I know we are running a little bit late, so I'm going to be very brief so as not to cut into their time. The first speaker will be Andrew McClellan, Professor of Art and Art History at Tufts University. Dr. McClellan is author of a book on the history of art museums entitled The Art Museum from Boulé to Bilbao. As a side note, he also recently curated an exhibit about Jumbo the elephant, which the Jinx Society made a pilgrimage to go see back in December, and we saw Jumbo's tail, and it was excellent. The second speaker will be Mary Terrell, historian of science and professor at UCLA. Her most recent book is Catching Nature in the Act, Réaumur and the Practice of Natural History in the 18th Century. She's also written a chapter on 18th century collecting, which will appear in the upcoming volume, Material Cultures of the Enlightenment. And finally, we will hear from Courtney Fullilove. Dr. Fullilove is assistant professor of history and affiliated faculty in the Science and Society program in the College of the Environment at Wesleyan University. She is now working on a book about seeds and agricultural development in the 19th century US. Her research interests also include intellectual property law, cultural heritage, and the history of bureaucracy, among other things. So just like yesterday, they will all speak, and we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A afterward. So welcome again, and I will turn it over to Dr. McClellan.
Well, thanks, Kate, and to everyone here. It's a great conference, and it's a great idea, and you guys are doing a great job putting things together. So Rosamond is a hard act to follow, is she here? And there's no competing with her images, but we're shifting to altogether different terrain here, away from natural history toward art, but a sensibility that she would no doubt be interested in. So in today's art world, museums offer themselves as a collector's hedge against oblivion. Placed safely beyond the march of time and transience of life, museums promise collectors internal remembrance. Art museums, driven by their own perpetual quest for superiority, echo the competitiveness of the collectors they collect, and in doing so, sustain rivalry beyond the grave. At the same time, a museum's compliance with prevailing taste and professional standards tends towards the obliteration of the individual collector. In a contest of wills, the distinctive vision and idiosyncratic whims of a collector may give way to a museum's master narrative and curatorial protocols. But not always. Indeed, exceptions are not hard to find. So, in order to secure the Edlis Neeson collection of pop art, the Art Institute of Chicago in 2015, just last month, promised to keep the collection together for the next 25 years and then in a modified display for a further quarter century. Chicago gets $500 million worth of art it could never afford to buy, and the collector came away equally pleased. Stefan Edlis said, "I feel like I hit the jackpot. Collectors all over the world are trying to figure out what to do with their art. Do they give it away, or do they build their own museums? A lot of collections get sold or dispersed simply because the art has nowhere to go." Had the director of the Metropolitan Museum been willing to make similar concessions to Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney when she approached him back in 1930, we would not be celebrating the new Whitney Museum of Art today. History reveals that such negotiations are nothing new. In Europe in the second half of the 19th century, international rivalry combined with insufficient government budgets for new acquisitions pushed museums into mutually gratifying relationships with private collectors. To acquire rare and costly masterpieces, museums enticed donors with the promise of public recognition. One Louvre official declared in 1883, Nothing is more honorable for a family than to have its name inscribed in the archives of the Louvre. Nothing is more flattering to a donor's elegance. All collectors thus cherish the dream of survival at the Louvre, for the Louvre consecrates the truly renowned lovers of art. The quid pro quo proved especially appealing to bourgeois eager to translate new money into cultural capital. The nouveau riche department store magnate Alfred Chauchard, for example, made a show of buying fashionable masterpieces, Millet's Angelus, and declaring his intent to give his collection to the Louvre, for which he received France's highest honor, the Légion d'honneur, several years before his death. The Chauchard collection, the good and the bad, passed from his elegant townhouse to a dedicated gallery in the Louvre in 1911. We know of at least one prominent collector, however, who resisted the entreaties of the Louvre, Edmond de Goncourt. Indeed, more than resist the Louvre, he denounced all that it stood for, in a gesture no less public than Chauchard's naked appeal for recognition. Following his death in 1896, Goncourt liquidated the entire contents of his extraordinary house museum on the outskirts of Paris in a sale that stretched over 4 days and was publicized through a lavishly illustrated multi-volume catalog. At the head of the catalog, Goncourt reproduced his will, a defiant rejoinder to the self-serving rhetoric of museum officials. And it reads, "My wish is that my drawings, my engraving, my bibelots, my books, in sum the pieces of art that have constituted the happiness of my life, are not consigned to the cold tomb of a museum and brute gaze of an indifferent passer-by. And I ask that they be dispersed at auction, and the pleasure I have enjoyed procuring each and every one of them be passed on to those who share my taste." If donating art to a national museum was an act of patriotism, selling one's collection was construed as selfish greed. But Goncourt was not in need of social validation, and he didn't want to be confused with those who, like Chauchard, did. More generally, as his will made clear, he detested what public museums entailed. The self-destruction of Goncourt's enchanted domain constituted a cri de coeur about the loss of rituals and values associated with private collecting. In point of fact, the relationship between public and private collecting has always been fraught. Europe's first public museums were fashioned in opposition to aristocratic collecting of the Ancien Régime. Early discussion of the Louvre during the French Revolution made clear, in the words of prominent Republicans, that it was to be more than a vain assemblage of luxurious and frivolous objects, and markedly different from the luxurious apartments of the wealthy, the voluptuous boudoirs of courtesans, and the cabinets of self-styled amateurs. Creating a space of public instruction required rational order, open access, and the elimination of decorative ornament that was the hallmark of the discredited Rococo style. Within a decade of opening in 1793, the revolutionary Louvre had become a public spectacle and a pedagogic machine, and as such, a model for museums elsewhere. Yet by no means everyone was pleased with the methodical taxonomy, educational purpose, and startling confluence of social classes. For elite art lovers, both French and foreign, the crowds and alienating atmosphere of the museum undermined modes of appreciation and rituals associated with proper consumption. Likening the museum to a mausoleum, the public museum's critics bemoaned not only a diminished experience for the beholder, but also the loss of integrity, of poetical effect, in works of art subjected to an altered viewing environment. Beginning in the 1790s, critics such as Quatremar de Quincy likened works of art to living plants that die in the process of being transplanted to a museum. In the following century, complaints about the alienating effects of museums became commonplace, culminating in Paul Valéry's essay, The Problem of Museums, of 1923, given greater currency through Adorno's famous essay, Valéry Proust Museum. Adorno correctly identified Valéry's reaction as a feudal lament for the loss of privilege and pleasure. Valéry complained that guards tell you to leave your cane at the door and to extinguish your cigarette. Public utility overrides private fantasy. In effect, museums are where art of the past goes to die. Museums may make us more erudite, but also more superficial and less appreciative of the marvels of art. Valéry wrote, "Venus in the museum becomes a mere document." In response to the rise of the public museum, 19th century private collections became more idiosyncratic, yet bound together by a shared commitment to serendipity and nostalgia for the ethos and elegance of the pre-revolutionary art lover. Restoring that world entailed the self-conscious pursuit of elite modes of consumption, objects with an evocative provenance, unexpected juxtapositions, and display of personal taste, all of which ran counter to the emerging norms of the public museum. Arguably, no one played the role of nostalgic collector and amateur or art lover with more zeal than Edmond de Goncourt. The creation of his personal house museum was the work of a lifetime, a labor of love and homage to the values of the Ancien Régime. Though the Goncourt collection was dispersed at public auction, according to Edmond's wishes, it was amply documented for posterity in impressive sales catalogs, commissioned photographs, and in his extraordinary book entitled The Book of an Artist, first published in 1881. In the book, Edmond takes the reader on an evocative tour of the house and collection while imparting his values as a collector along the way. He begins his tour in the vestibule, where he's seen in the etching, where an eclectic array of Japanese and Chinese objets d'art surrounds one of his prize objects, a sculptural relief by the Rococo master Clodion on the wall to his left, which Goncourt had found incorrectly catalogued at a public auction. A portrait etching by Félix Bracquemond shows Goncourt in this space, as if welcoming the viewer to a tour. The next two rooms were the dining room decorated with Rococo tapestries and a small salon in which 18th century drawings were hung on scarlet walls offset by woodwork painted a glossy black. The book lists the drawings and includes digressions on the artists and how and where Goncourt acquired them. The large salon that followed was home to things he described as the happiest discoveries of my youth. In other words, the most extraordinary Rococo and Asian works of art he had found all over the place. The staircase leading to the more intimate display spaces on the floor above featured an engraving after Watteau's Pilgrimage to Cythera, a masterpiece of the Rococo that for Goncourt, Baudelaire, Nerval, and other romantics had come to symbolize melancholic longing for youth, for love, for imaginative escape from the present. Upstairs was his study containing a remarkable collection of 18th century autograph letters and manuscripts, books, auction catalogs, and ephemera pertaining to everyday life, all of which were valued by Goncourt because they contained what he called the touch, the trace of past hands, and bore, therefore, the mark of history. The pièce de résistance in Goncourt's bedroom was an immense bed, which he described as a marvel of sculpture and one of those monumental beds in which the 18th century rendered comfortable the birth and death of man. Found in an antique shop near the Bastille, the bed had been used by the Princesse de Lamballe, the rumored lover of Marie Antoinette. It was a quintessential Goncourt object, involving salvage from the obscurity of bric-a-brac and the sublimation of sexual desire through collecting. The display in Goncourt's house consciously defied museological conventions with its unusual wall colors and coverings, the unexpected and playful juxtapositions of different media, and the mixing of French and Asian objects. He criticized other private collections that were insufficiently idiosyncratic, such as the great Czerniewski collection, which he damned by likening to the Louvre in atmosphere. A marked contingency in display reflected the serendipity of the collection's formation. Crucial to Goncourt's narrative were the elements of chance and the chase that define personal collecting. The objects that got away haunted Goncourt, and yet he accepted that his losses were others' gains. Chance and competition heightened the thrill of discovery and possession. His book is sprinkled with recollections of finds among the junk shops of Paris. The elements of chance and fate embedded in a private collection and its presentation differed fundamentally from the ideal of plenitude in public museums. In museum displays, art historical gaps, and all museum gaps, are acknowledged only when they are filled, and the life history of objects is omitted from wall labels. Goncourt celebrated private art forms and associated modes of appreciation not possible in public museums. Drawings and terracotta sculptures made for close scrutiny. Bibelots that nestled in the palm of a hand. The look of objects illuminated by candlelight. He identified the sense of touch, prohibited in museums, as the sign of the true art lover, touch, not vision. And he extolled the pleasures of studying drawings while smoking opium-laced cigars. Proximity to objects and the luxury of smoke exude from Bracquemond's delicately etched portrait, a work whose own tactile and tonal qualities reward close viewing. Bracquemond presents Goncourt as the inescapable mediating force in his own collection. The editor of the official edition of La Maison recalled Goncourt's hypnotic presence. He stopped in front of each work of art and showed it to me with the wave of a hand, an aristocratic gesture both affable and appealing that brought him to life. A few words of explanation delivered quickly and precisely in a beautiful, solemn voice, almost distant and disguising his emotion. A word about its purchase, a brief story, and then, forgetting about me, he fell silent as if entranced by a memory or a dream. Visible to only himself were the reflections of his life in the mirrors, the varnished and patined surfaces. According to the editor, the Goncourts abhorred the communal nature of public museums, quote, where everything belongs to everyone, where everything seems to them humiliated, soiled, and corrupted in an atmosphere of pedantry and stupidity. In the comfort of the Goncourts' home, works of art were also caressed by words. Art was to be protected not only from crude hands and the brute gaze of an indifferent public, but also from offending speech. He famously remarked, "A painting in a museum probably hears more stupid remarks than anything else in the world." By contrast, in the sanctum of his home, his treasures absorbed the animated conversation of his circle of artists, writers, and bon vivants. Not to mention the voices of past artists, summoned through the original letters and quotidian documents that he collected. Goncourt's efforts to give voice to the past calls to mind Stephen Greenblatt's Computing Museological Strategies of Resonance and Wonder. Resonance, for Greenblatt, entails conjuring the historical milieu whence displayed objects came, while wonder privileges the visual properties of objects at the expense of their context. Resonance involves the intimation of a larger community of voices and skills and imagined ethnographic thickness surrounding the objects. Wonder, by contrast, cultivates the gaze, cuts through the ethnographic thickness, and stills all those murmuring voices around an object. Goncourt's house is the epitome of resonance, and it was fashioned deliberately against the backdrop of an emergent modern museology with its emphasis on visual consumption of masterpieces, streamlined displays, stable taxonomies, and public pedagogy. To read Goncourt's book is to be confronted by an intense ethnographic thickness, a host of murmuring voices relayed through the mass of anecdote enveloping his objects, the recalled dinner parties, the eclectic documents quoted in their rich particularity, and not least, the voice of Goncourt himself as narrator and tour guide. The critic Gustave Geffroy paid Goncourt the highest compliment when he described his house as an original creation without precedent or possible imitation. So intimately was Goncourt connected with his house that it couldn't survive his passing. Besides, the logic of Goncourt's collecting practice, as specified in his will, demanded the recirculation of his cherished treasures so that kindred spirits could form collections of their own. The loss of his collection would further the creation of others. Goncourt's, meanwhile, photographs and the Goncourt text offered inspiration beyond the grave of what a private collection might be. Another option for private collectors who shared Goncourt's values but who couldn't bring themselves to follow his lead was to fossilize their life's work in museum form. The Gardner in Boston is perhaps the best-known example of such a personal collection museum. Like Goncourt's house, the Gardner is dotted with portraits, personal letters, and highly idiosyncratic installations, not least Isabella's Worth gown, displayed below Titian's Rape of Europa. The prospect of rejection from private collectors forced public museums a century ago into the sort of compromise I related at the start. In the end, however, both idiosyncrasy and resonance ran counter to the spread of professional standards in museums, which encouraged homogenization and a focused display on masterpieces. In other words, on the generation of wonder. The ostensibly neutral white cube environment, arguably the most pervasive product of modern museology, is purposefully inhospitable to the resonant trappings associated with private collections. Personal collection museums have surged again in the last few decades in tandem with our new Gilded Age and a booming art market. And yet, owing to the guiding influence of trained curators, advisors, and architects under the sway of modern museological principles, we find progressively less difference between those collections and their public counterparts. Today, private and public collections pursue the same artists and architects. Contemporary private museums are little more than public museums writ small. At the same time, the postmodern turn to installation and performance art, immersive experience, and relational aesthetics, in defiance of the numbing homogeneity of public museums, has revived interest in the space and practices of early private collections, Mark Dion and others. The Gardner, the Barnes, the Frick, and other personal collection museums have never been more popular, leaving us to regret that Goncourt followed through on his final wish to dismantle his house and to cast his collections to the winds. Thank you.
So I wanted to thank everyone who was involved in putting this conference together. It's just been a really eclectic and imaginative group of presentations, and I've gotten so many ideas from it, and I feel really pleased that I get to be a part of it. So thank you. It's fairly well known within the Smithsonian Institution. Oh, I should also say there's the title of my paper is The Hair of Distinguished Persons in the Patent Office Building Museum. I'm going to be talking about John Varden's role in collecting that. And what I wanted to say is that within the Smithsonian Institution, it's fairly well known that the kernel of the collection is the kernel of the collection of the U.S. National Museum, or the castle, was the collection of the National Institute for the Promotion of Science. Oh my, something went wrong already. Which was formed largely to lobby for James Smithson's bequest to the U.S. government for the establishment of an institution for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men. So the leaders of the National Institute believed that the bequest should be used to support scientific expeditions, including the one currently in progress in 1838 to the Pacific Islands. But what few realize is that it's not just the collections of the U.S. exploring expedition to the Pacific that form the kernel of the Smithsonian collections. Here are just a few. But also the personal cabinet of a man named John Varden, whose collections the National Institute purchased in an attempt to build its own and established its worthiness for the Smithson bequest. And so I'm writing much more broadly about the array of specimens that ended up being housed in the museum and the Patent Office building, and debates over what gave those specimens value. But today I want to talk about only John Varden and what he collected. If Varden's collection was sufficiently distinguished to be the basis of a national museum, I think he deserves more institution than he's customarily received. We tend to read this history backwards from the Smithsonian as a foil to our own systems of order. And although we may acknowledge that modern scientific and social scientific disciplines have their own derangements, it's difficult to present their predecessors without constant reference to more familiar systems of order and selection. And I'm not going to pretend to be able to do that, but I do want to try to recover collections of Vardens that have been relegated to the status of antiquarian curiosities or souvenirs. And as the title of my paper suggests, I want to talk about his collection of hair, which included the hair of dead presidents, everyone from Washington to George Washington to Franklin Pierce, as well as other distinguished persons, including Samuel Morse and Senator Henry Clay, the future president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. And I want to talk about the hair, not because I think it's nasty or strange, but because I think it has something to tell us about our shifts in sensibilities of historical representation and its relationship to the material world. Historians of science, especially, have done very important work examining a transition from imperatives of curiosity and singularity to order and typicality, and I think that those reflections are relevant here. But today I want to talk more about Victorian relic culture and its disqualification from early 20th century museums. Why did Varden collect the hair of US presidents and distinguished persons? And what does its display and subsequent concealment tell us about our ideas of historical representation? So first I want to give you a bit of background about the Patent Office Museum and what was in it. And then I'll tell you a bit about Varden and his employments, and then I'll talk about his collection of hair. So in the mid-19th century, the museum and the Patent Office building, this is it. Some of you probably recognize it as the National Portrait Gallery, which it is now. The museum housed the spoils of far-flung military, commercial, and scientific expeditions. As to the reason they were in the Patent Office, this is complicated and interesting and beyond the scope of this paper, but one of the reasons is that it was the biggest building in Washington at the time, so I'll just take the simple way out. Alternately styled as a cabinet of curiosities, a national gallery, and a temple of invention, the galleries amassed collections of natural science through the Navy and Consular Service, as well as American Indian artifacts symbolizing territorial mastery over the continental West. Between 1840 and the American Civil War, its collections swelled to include the spoils of Pacific expeditions, the Mexican War, collections of the Corps of Topographical Engineers in the American West, and numerous personal donations and diplomatic gifts. Tourists and journalists flocked to the halls of the Great Cabinet of Curiosities, as they called it, which boasted between 10 and 15,000 visitors per month, and quickly became the nation's most popular tourist attraction. The collections formed a kernel of the U.S. National Museum of the Smithsonian, the Castle Building, as I said, which was inaugurated in 1857, 1858. When the Patent Office Museum opened to the public in 1841, however, it put John Varden out of business. Oops, well, we're skipping ahead to his hair, but that's fine. Varden wasn't of the Eastern intelligentsia. He was actually a local theatrical technician and museum entrepreneur. He was a very enthusiastic collector of relics and curiosities, and when he traveled for theater productions, he collected as he went. And in 1836, he opened his home to the public as the Washington City Museum. At first admission was free. He encouraged a donation. In 1840, he moved to the Masonic Hall at 4th and D, and he devoted himself to the museum full-time. And I should say here that I've learned a lot from Larry Bird, the curator of political history at the Smithsonian American History Museum, who wrote an excellent bit on Varden in his catalog of a recent collection called Souvenir Nation. Recent exhibition, rather. So the museum opened to the public in 1840 in the Masonic Hall. It has 2 floors. On the first floor, there are natural science specimens, Indian artifacts, curiosities. Admission is 25 cents. On the top floor, there are musical productions, changing exhibitions, talks. I believe that was 50 cents. Varden's personal collection ranged very widely, but he emphasized nature specimens. Inventories he prepared listed coins, shells, fish heads, metals, stalactite, insects, and Indian ornaments. He also had a page from the Inquisition in Barcelona, a pig with 1 body and 2 heads and 3 ears, a very large hairball that he got from a dam in a stream south of a tannery in Cooperstown, New York, an English musket ball that he removed from his brother's shoulder, a wild bat, a jackal, 2 Egyptian mummies, which he especially prized. Varden's commitment to making his hall a public exhibition space reflected the contention that museum collections should be sites of public education, a sensibility that was shared with such denizens of early American society as Charles Willson Peale, whose Museum of Rational Amusement was the first public collection in Philadelphia. And Varden echoed Peale's intent to expand his collection for a public exhibition, explicitly describing it as a rational place of amusement. And then all of a sudden in 1841, just as he had opened the museum in the Masonic Hall, he had competition. That same year, Secretary of War Joel Robert Poinsett, along with several other prominent Washingtonians, founded the National Institute, in part to compete for the bequest of James Smithson, which they thought should support the maintenance of scientific expeditions in their collections. In a bid for power over the American scientific establishment, Poinsett modeled the Institute on early American scientific societies in Philadelphia, such as the American Philosophical Society and its London forebear, the Royal Society. The National Institute aggressively built its collections, solicited via a wide network of members whom it enlisted through correspondence. In an effort to expand its natural history collections quickly, it also purchased the entirety of John Varden's Washington City Museum in 1841. So many prominent private European cabinets had public audiences, and Varden's institution fell into a standard pattern of collecting behavior in this sense. The National Institute's purchase of Varden's collection was also consistent with a broader Euro-American movement of private cabinets to municipal ownership. And this change in ownership was a precursor to the subsequent development of national museums. The National Intelligencer, the most prominent Washington paper, very much admired Varden's collection, declaring it a fine example of enterprise and unceasing industry in pursuit of all that was singular and wonderful in nature, praising Varden's enthusiastic admiration for all that is curious in nature and art. Soon these subjective interpretations would be displaced by the popularization of Linnaean taxonomy for botanical collections and the classifications of Georges Cuvier in paleontology and zoology. Geologists, too, would close ranks, and the American Society for Geologists challenged the National Institute for membership. The emphasis of these systems and institutions wasn't on an extraordinary individual objects, but on the arrangement of objects according to categories of genus, species, subspecies, variety. emerging notions of scientific objectivity displaced wonder and individual judgment as optics for interpreting nature. But for the moment, idiosyncratic collection was the norm. And so Varden's eclecticism isn't as surprising as it might seem to us, as accustomed to orderly displays of specimens selected for their typicality. Varden prized his 2 Egyptian mummies, for example, which were a fairly standard showpiece, but also his personal collection of presidential hair, which you see here. And these frames with locks from every American president traveled with him from the National Gallery to the Smithsonian Institution. So one of the things I just find fascinating about Varden is the length of his tenure with these museums. He's alternately described in histories as a curator or a janitor. When he goes with the collections, it's really as a caretaker rather than an architect in some sense. His formal position is the gallery's mechanic and exhibition manager. So first he reports to the National Institute, then to the leader of the U.S. exploring expedition and to the Commissioner of Patents, and finally to the Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, Joseph Henry, after the collections were transferred there beginning in 1858. Varden performed all aspects of what we would now consider curatorship or conservation, treating the blue mold-on mummies with benzene and charcoal fire, or building and painting exhibition cases. Varden was paid an annual salary for his labors. He was closer to the collections in the museum than anyone, unboxing, documenting, preserving, and arranging them for storage or display. And ultimately, there were simply too many specimens and not enough money or space to care for them. At times, he found boxes of things with no indication as to what they were or where they came from. On one occasion, he reported finding a box roughly 5 feet long containing what appeared to be Turkish guns, iron war clubs, lances, staffs, lanterns, and stirrups, without any letter enclosed or directions as to what to do with these things. Actually, likely these were Turkish swords and guns presented to Thomas Jefferson by the Emperor of Morocco, which Varden identified in a later catalog and displayed in the National Gallery. And the museum had problems. Some complained that the Institute's entomological collections, which were some of its finest, were nearly destroyed for want of proper care. And the U.S. exploring expedition collections, most of them never saw the light of day, remaining packed in crates in cellars and garrets. So onto the hair. I don't know very much about how Varden collected the hair, and I'm working on knowing more. We know that he first framed the locks when he was working for the National Institute in the Patent Office, but he considered the hair his personal property. He presented it to the Patent Office, in 1853, and at the Baltimore Mechanics Fair the same year. In 1855, he separated the presidential locks out from the hair of other distinguished persons, including Morrison, Henry Clay, and Jeff Davis. And I started getting interested in how he might have gotten the hair, and so I was reading other accounts of collecting hair specimens. I read one about Lincoln's autopsy, in which a young physician who was attending the procedure begged and clamored for a lock of the president's hair, and being denied, ultimately sort of grabbed a piece from the floor, which had somehow gotten detached. And I think it's a bit hard for us to imagine this scene, even though we also know that fragments of Lincoln's skull, preserved by the physician attending his death, remain on display at the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Washington, D.C., which, as some of you may know, is on the campus of the Walter Reed Medical Center. And it's there along with the bullet that was pulled from Garfield and a giant bezoar hairball removed from a girl's stomach. Smithsonian enthusiasts probably know that all of these collections were formerly in the Army Medical Museum, which is occupied the site, which is now the Hirshhorn Gallery. Walter Reed is a little bit harder to get to. You have to show ID and clear security, and the museum is always empty. And I can't really figure out whether that makes the display of all of these relics more or less strange. So I don't think Varden was clambering around on the floor of autopsies of presidents. We know that he got much of it through solicited donations and purchase. The display case was inscribed, "Those having hair of distinguished persons would confer a favor by adding to this collection." And this strikes me as interesting because it's very hard to vouch for its authenticity. And yet to me, this is one of the really interesting things about it. The claim of hair is to be very specific and authenticate identity, to be unique. But in fact, it can very easily be substituted or interchanged for other hair. That is, locks of hair are valuable precisely because they're individualized, incommensurate with other hair. And yet, in some ways, hair is hair. That Varden purchased it suggests that it had some commodity value. It could have a price affixed to it. And indeed, however special the claim to authenticity, hair preservation and decoration was a Victorian industry. There are many people in this room who know more about hair work and hair jewelry than I do, which that's not something I thought I would ever say to a room full of people. But as we know from yesterday, hair work and hair jewelry has a very long history, which perhaps reached its apex in the later 19th century, especially in Britain. It emerges from a cult of saints. There's a long practice of placing royal tresses in jewelry. This was a civilian practice by the 17th century, but is a craze from the 1850s to 1880s. So this very busy industry flourishes with ready-made lockets and standardized designs. Jewelers would accept hair through the mail with instructions as to what to do with it. And here I'm relying on the work of Teresa Barnett and Elizabeth Lutz, which have written wonderfully about hair jewelry. And they point out, I think rightly, that there's an irony that the means of authenticating identity through hair and retaining singularity, which is in many ways an act of resistance against industrialization and commodification, nevertheless also becomes an artifact of it, right? So you depend on your ready-made locket. So Varden kept a diary. And as I said, he's not of the Eastern intelligentsia. He spells phonetically for the most part. He clearly has a Southern regional accent. In many ways, his diary is a very classic 19th century diary, which is to say there's a lot about the weather, and at times nothing else, clear and pleasant, clear and cold, very hard rain, wind blowing hard from the northwest. It's also humbling to read just because of the sheer quantity of death in it. His friends, very close family. At times it seems like a day doesn't go by without a funeral. And while I think occasionally you can sort of feel his sadness, it's never stated outright in the diary. For the most part, it's a record of work, cleaning the mold off of the mummies, building display cases, sorting and packing specimens for removal to the castle. And when he cataloged his collections, he aimed to do so by the standards of the day, but he struggled to keep up with these changing documentary practices, and many of his older collections before 1829 were made useless by his lack of documentation. So, for example, he has a hairbrush made by the natives of Blank. And he also he had ostrich eggs and a porpoise's jawbone that he got in Baltimore, but with no information as to its provenance. He made a good faith effort to follow new documentary practices, privileging geography and provenance as markers of representational value with respect to culture and environment, rather than being valuable because of their self-evident singularity. The specimen was becoming a proxy for information about geography and environment and culture. But when Varden thought about his own collections, I'd wager that those accumulated dossiers of information were fairly irrelevant to him. For him, they were valuable as curiosities, singular representations of natural diversity. His collections do fit into this category, and they're easily subjected to the pejorative cast that gradually accrued to trivial or anomalous objects, no longer valued as extraordinary individuals, but rather made irrelevant by their lack of reference to like objects. Wonder, once an instrument of enlightened speculation, became an indication of prurience or gullibility. So we can consider him an exemplar of a defunct or expiring sense of curiosity, but I'd also argue that the relics are key to understanding his frame of mind. When I was working through the diaries, for a while I was wishing that they were digitized so that I could use some of those newfangled text mining tools to get what I wanted, or at least just get all the phrases about the weather out so I could see what the diary was really about. And then something shifted as I was reading through them, as I got into a kind of rhythm. And I began to see the weather and the death as a sort of key to the diaries. Weather and death are unchangeable. They're completely exogenous. We have to work around them. But they also structure our lives. In that sense, they're very stable and predictable. They're some of the only things that we know will happen. And in that sense, they defy time, or at least they trump it. And so does Varden's collection of hair. It preserves the bodies of great men in perpetuity. It puts them into the present tense in defiance of their absence. In fact, their bodily presence is partially restored. They remain among us. So Varden and the diaries, the packing of shells itself takes forever. The seasons changed. Snow thaws occasionally, according to Varden. There's a very beautiful morning. And then one day, well after the move is complete in 1865, there's a fire and the whole castle burns with many of the collections in it. Varden's homesick, but he goes the next day to see the damage, and he actually just can't recover from it, and he dies shortly thereafter. And the secretary of the Smithsonian, Joseph Henry, cleans up his workroom after his death and gives most of the stuff to his wife, suggests that maybe she can auction some of it. But a lot of it remains in the Smithsonian's collections, including the diary. Henry never wanted a museum for the Smithsonian. He thought it should be a research institute. He only accepted the collections because it was the way to get the appropriations. He farmed out the task to Spencer Baird, who built the nature collection systematically. His protege and successor, George Brown Good, applied the same systematic approach to human history. And together they established new disciplinary logics for classification and display, with plants separated from tools and bones and artifacts of US military power recast as the material evidence of human history. And so we see many relics remade as historical artifacts representative of either human development or social achievement, and often in the US national case, military conquest of the West. But Varden's hair just doesn't fit in this order. In his daybook, a researcher has put a blue check mark next to each entry that documents a transfer of collections to the Smithsonian. But there are no check marks next to the hairball from Cooperstown or the musket ball removed from his brother's shoulder. A very fast postscript. In 1860, the first delegation of Japanese visitors came to the United States, and they visited the Smithsonian, and they saw the hair, and they were disgusted by it. They thought it was barbaric that the hair of presidents would be on display. And this was reported with some amusement through the 20th century by historians who were convinced that the Japanese had simply seen a display of wigs and misunderstood. And so why couldn't they understand that 19th century Americans could have kept and publicly displayed the hair of dead presidents and other distinguished persons? I have a lot of thoughts about this, but I've run out of time. And so I'm going to sort of pose it to you as a riddle. I don't think the hair was a curiosity. It wasn't a sacred relic. I think it was symbolic, and I think it was a way to assert the presence of the past in the material world. I think that's a very different style of representation than the one we've become accustomed to. But the fact that it was the American historians rather than the Japanese visitors that mistranslated 19th century American museums suggests to me that the past is much more strange than we've allowed ourselves to make it. So I'll stop there. Oh, right. In the distinguished persons or the presidents or both?
I think she was before two presidents that she asked.
Well, so it's pre-Lincoln, so we stop at Franklin Pierce. So the sort of array of mediocre Democratic presidents in the 1850s are well represented. Interestingly, in the distinguished persons category, Jefferson Davis is among them. Probably if you went a decade forward in time, he would have been exiled from the hair collection for political reasons. But at the time that wasn't the case. Samuel Morse, Senator Henry Clay, as they said. I'm drawing a blank. The resolution on the photographs isn't good enough to pull out. Thank you. Yes. So it is a catalog of prominent people in the arts and law and politics, and inventors. Thank you. Other questions?
I have a question about Bremer and Buffon. Was there hatred for one another, just rivalry, or was there a dispute, a theoretical dispute? What was the...
It's kind of a long story, which is why I didn't really get into it, but, it's partly a generational thing, but it's also, it's really hard to know specifically what set it off, because, Buffon is a generation younger than Mayo. But when he first came to Paris, they were friendly. They shared a lot of the same interests. They operated in the same context in the academic sciences. But Buffon became director of the Botanical Garden over the objections of Bremer, who had his own person that he was trying to get in there. So that was part of it. but they also had very different styles. Ramure objected to Buffon's sort of grand philosophical vision and his inability to observe the details. So from Ramure's point of view, Buffon was a lousy observer, and from Buffon's point of view, Ramure was a lover of the trivial. And so there's a difference in style, which is also a difference in like what it means to do natural history. So, but it was also personal. It was also personal.
I'm gonna hand this mic to the speakers. This round. Next question. Steve.
Question about the Harris president. Do you know its display history? How long was it on display? When did it go on display? Is it going back?
So, do I need this?
Yes.
Okay, I see. I feel like a game show host. I know that in 1853, it was put on display in the Patent Office Museum, and the same year it was lent to the Baltimore Mechanics Fair. And I know that it was displayed again in 1855. Most recently, and this is, I mentioned Larry Bird, the curator of political history, it was on display at the castle just this last year in an exhibition called Souvenir Nation. And so, I'm playing a little loose with the category of lost museums, but it was in Vardon's workroom in the Smithsonian for a long time, and it didn't burn, but it wasn't on display in the castle. It was returned, or it stayed in his collections that were there, along with his ledgers. So short.
Between then and now, was the Smithsonian embarrassed by it?
My impression is that it's one of these things that ended up in our nation's attic, as it were. It certainly hasn't been prominently displayed in the Smithsonian for many, many years, whereas in the 1850s, it was something you would go look at, even though Vardon considered it his own sort of private project.
Great. Another question, right here.
So for Andrew McClellan, I was very interested by something you said towards the end of your talk about immersive installations and relational aesthetics, and you suggested that that's a way of returning to an affective way of responding to things in the museum or the museum space. And were you suggesting that this is something that only artists now have permission to do, or do you also now see curators trying to create that kind of affective bond, with objects which earlier the collectors could claim?
Yeah, I think I think there's tensions if you're a museum curator, because there are standards that have been so internalized over the last century that to step outside of those standards is somewhat risky. But you do see risk-taking going on. I mean, but in a tentative way, I would say. One manifestation of change is that museums have taken to installing Wunderkammer. The Baltimore Museum is a great one.
Do you know what I mean? So the curator is not doing that themselves, but they are reminding you of what others have done. So it's at a remove.
Yeah.
It's like you're not willing to be the author of that kind of display.
Yeah, that's fair enough, I think. I've noticed that displays of 18th century art, Rococo art, which depended for its life really on a mixed media approach. I've seen museums that have started to reintroduce porcelain and furniture into those spaces along with paintings to try and, hint at an original context. That's too rather safe, you might say. Special exhibitions are where you can have fun, but the permanent collection remains pretty much frozen, it seems to me, and also utterly conventional, one museum to the other.
Other questions? All right, well, I would like to thank all of our speakers. Let's give them a round of applause. And we do have sandwiches available in our next session, which is lunch, and 2 shows should start here at noon, or Liz might have more info.
It's starting at 12:30.
Oh, okay, sorry.
The shows are starting at 12:30, so if you want to go outside, get some sunshine, breathe in the fresh air, and then come right back.